First of all, thank you for including me in this session. I feel a little bit of an interloper here because there are so many experts that I can see on the screen, and the people you've already heard from are far more expert in this than I am. But what I'm trying to do is translate some of these really knotty problems onto, well, what do I do at a field scale? And I'm lucky enough to be a part of a family that own 2,000 acres, so 800 hectares in northwest Essex. And at the moment, 660 of those hectares are cropped. We have a mix of farming tenants, so we have multi-generational Agricultural Holdings Act tenants who will be, whose families will be on the land long after I am, and have been on the land long before I arrived. But we also have farming business tenants, and we have some in-hand land as well. We have around 80 hectares of woodland already, so we have about 10% of woodland. And as part of a natural capital appraisal that that I spearheaded last year, we sort of reimagined some of the ways that we measure our land, and one of the key metrics that came out of it was, and Neil's talked about hedgerows earlier, and that's a really interesting one because we've always been very used to measuring our hedgerows in a linear basis. You know, we've got so many kilometres of hedgerows, but actually what we did is we got a new data set and we flew over the top of it and said, actually, we've got 19 hectares of hedgerows. And that means that actually we can start to think about, you know, what is the biomass that that's producing? What is the carbon that's sequestering? How do we then manage those hedgerows in a slightly different way? But the backdrop to all of this, because I come from prior to coming back to run the family business, I worked in catchment management with environmental charities. So the ecosystem approach is something that I naturally go to in terms of trying to understand how things happen, and water flows is where I start from because that's my sort of comfort zone. And so in that remit, I started to look at solving problems that we have in the neighbourhood. And we have a flooding problem in our local village. It's a very small village. There are 18 houses at risk. It would never get flood funds from any other source. So we had to be a bit creative, and I wanted to try and do something with my prior knowledge, but also my ability to influence land use on that. And so we dreamt up a natural flood management project, which used sort of standard sort of timber engineering techniques. We used wood from the estate to slow the water down, reconnect the floodplain, but we also used beavers. So we brought beavers back into the, and this sort of exemplifies my kind of way of looking at these sort of things, is that I understand that there are a massive array, and we've heard some of them today, massive array of issues to contend with, a massive diversity of approaches, and you just have to look at the chat to realise that, you know, there are people doing a million different things. And at some point, if you're in any way in charge of a landholding, you've got to work out which ones to pick. You've then got to go down a route, and then you start to have some of those challenges that Susan and others have outlined in terms of, you know, how's it taxed? How do the revenue and the capital elements stack up? How does the management system look like? You know, which things can you actually derive a revenue stream from, and which things are things that you perhaps shouldn't be trying to market? So this is sort of the background of our thinking, which has been which has evolved into a natural capital appraisal, which started to give us some kind of figures for this. So we did do some sort of pounds, shillings and pence valuations over the whole estate, but what we also did is look at transition. So I have a node of project plans which include more beaver areas and a sort of riparian rewilding project of around about 100 acres, so sort of 40 odd hectares. Woodland creation to link up areas of semi-natural, semi-ancient woodland that we've got, but also then things like agroforestry that sort of Niels and others were talking about. So I know that there are people on the call here I can see, and I know that are ahead of me in terms of, you know, actually delivering agroforestry. But what we're trying to do is look at how do we transition about half of our cropped area, so, you know, between 300 and 400 hectares, from its current sort of conventional commodities driven system. So very much you could say it's a food first approach, but the food it produces variously goes directly into the human supply chain, or it goes via, you know, animal feeds or something like that, or even in some cases it just goes straight into an anaerobic digester. So we're trying to think about, you know, how do I flip that? So from my perspective, looking at it from a business point of view, I've got revenue streams that I do from, some of our diversified activities like holiday cottages, wildlife watching, woodlands, things like that. But then the vast majority of my income at the moment, my business income at the moment, is tenant rents. So I look at that and I immediately look down my own kind of financial supply chain and go, well, hang on a minute, that's a bit of a risk. Everyone's incomes are going to, everyone in the agricultural sector's incomes are going to change over the next 10 years. Some of those are going to come under significant pressure. Some of the tenants we've got are operating at relatively small scale. So there's two things. One is, how do I mitigate my own risk from a business, but also how do I introduce additional opportunities for my tenants that means that then their businesses are more sustainable in the long term. It's all very well asking them to introduce diversity into their system, but if they're trying to support 2 families off 250 acres, even in East Anglia, where we've got some nice productive land, it's a tough ask to say, you need to take this amount out of production, or, the transition, the financial transition is tough, because if you're going to reduce your revenue flows, you need to find some way of basically paying the bills. And the same, doesn't matter what scale you're operating at, the same is true for me and my business. So what I'm trying to do now is map out a system where the end point is a much more balanced system. So I perhaps don't produce food as my first port of call, but actually I am an environmental goods producer. So I produce clean water, I produce plentiful water, and I reduce flood risk. So, those are things that I understand and I think I can do on my holding. And then we also look at biodiversity. So we were lucky enough to be selected as one of the 9 national pilot projects for the Natural England's Biodiversity Net Gain pilot. So we're getting a really good insight as to how that might work, but also then things like carbon sequestration. And you very quickly run into some of these blockers that your other speakers have articulated far better than I can. That, some systems fall within existing accreditation schemes. So woodland creation, tick, you can get a carbon income on that through the Woodland Carbon Code. Agroforestry, no, you can't, because it doesn't fall within the definition of forestry under the Forestry Act and various other issues. So, there's a lot of things you can't do. Soil carbon, there is no current UK accreditation system for that either. So, whilst I'm only going to be looking to sell the excess, that means that my business is climate positive, and then I sell the bits that I generate over and above the things that I need to offset my own unavoidable emissions. I still can't do that in an accredited setting. I also can't do water in an accredited setting. There is no accreditation for systems, actions, practices, outcomes measurements for clean water. So we've built a partnership with our local water companies where we're trying to build a baseline for these sort of things. So this is where I sort of come at this from. And the final element, which I was really pleased was picked up by a lot of people that you've heard from today, actually is the social side of things. So my estate, back at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, housed and provided employment for directly, it was over 100 people. Now, my estate, I employ myself and 2 others. So, that just shows you what the change in farming systems are. I think perhaps it was Janet was saying earlier about, the kind of replacement of people in the environment. Now, what I'm suggesting isn't that we just try and create employment for the sake of employment. What I'm suggesting is that part of this system, if I introduce diversity to my system, there will be more opportunities to pick up some of the things that Susan was saying about, harnessing different ways of working with social entrepreneurs, commercial entrepreneurs. We've got a growing relationship with a charity that looks at delivering mental health, well-being, skills training, using the kind of environment to do that. So, it's building all of these things into what is otherwise currently a fairly simple system. And it's fair to say that some of my contemporaries and some of my members of my family look at me like I'm mad, because I'm just trying to do, I'm trying to bring all these things into one relatively small land area, whilst it's, large enough for me to get my teeth into. Susan's point about scale is very interesting, because it's just, I still can't demonstrate enough impact to be talking to, any of the kind of investment market. So it's all just trying to work out how do we deliver these things. but then do it in a way that I can then in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time have enough information to be able to demonstrate my impact, but also then feed back into my management system that says, okay, you put agroforestry systems in place here, here, and here. This one is doing brilliant things for biodiversity. This one's doing brilliant things for nutrition. This one's not doing great for anything. Right, okay, let's change that system. Let's see if we can deliver something better. And be flexible and be responsive rather than the current way that I look out my office window and see, you know, I've got a hedge, a woodland, a field, and just sort of say, well, actually, traditional wisdom says that it's very risky to change any of that. So, you know, do tiny little bits on the edge first. I confess to being quite impatient. You know, I mean, the environmental land management scheme isn't going to be fully operable till 2024. You know, climate change, the biodiversity crisis, these are things that we absolutely need to act on now. So I really want to be fully up and running with a new system within 2 or 3 years. Because if it takes much longer than that, we're just losing the game. You know, we're heading closer towards 4 degrees temperature rise. And in our part of East Anglia, that's going to be, you know, the land grade that I farm on, which is currently 2 to 3, could actually degrade down to 2050, could degrade down to 4. So unless I do something about it now, I'm actually going, my underlying assets are going to degrade and I'm not going to be able to support the business. So